Hello, and welcome to Baltic Ways, a podcast bringing you interviews and insights from the world of Baltic studies. I'm your host, Indra Ekmanis. Aro Velmet is an associate professor of history at the University of Southern California, where he is a historian of modern Europe, colonialism, science, technology, and medicine with an overarching interest in gender studies. Today, in our conversation, we speak about recent changes to LGBTQ+ issues in Estonia and the broader region, and the path that has led to where we are today. Stay tuned. Dr. Aro Velmet, thank you so much for joining us on Baltic Ways. Your research interests are pretty varied, right? They stretch across the globe to look at how microbiology became a tool of French colonial governance, all the way to the history of digital statecraft in the Soviet Union and post-Soviet Estonia and in the global South. But today our conversation is going to focus a little bit on your work on gender and the current state of LGBTQ rights in the Baltic states. But before we get there, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your academic interests?
Yeah, well, thank you, Indra. Thank you for inviting me to the show. I am, as you said, primarily a historian of science and technology, and I'm interested basically in the ways that various kinds of experts make claims on politics and power, how they reformulate questions that we think of as essentially questions of politics, who gets to cross borders, who gets to have various kinds of rights as questions of technological expertise. So this may mean, formulating public health policy,
Mhm.
right? If a pandemic breaks out, then who needs to be vaccinated? What kinds of populations need to be surveilled, monitored, regulated? This is what the sort of first decade of my academic career was dedicated to in the context of the French Empire. Or it may mean questions around, gender and reproduction. It may mean questions around how democracy is conducted, which is sort of what I'm researching right now. But I guess at the heart of it really is this question, and really this kind of utopian vision of using technological expertise to solve these political quagmires, these debates that Western societies have been wrestling with for well over a century, and that lots of different scientists have had the idea that maybe the way to break these problems open is through the application of this or that novel technology. So that's kind of what I'm broadly interested in academically. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that. That is really interesting. I'm sure that there are many, many different ways you can take that too. A lot of questions that have a lot of resonance in today's world. Yeah. Well, we're also returning to the subject at hand today. In the past year or so, we've had some significant sort of legislative steps happen in the Baltic states around LGBTQ plus rights, particularly in Estonia and Latvia. Estonia adopted a marriage equality bill. In Latvia, civil unions are legal as of July 1 this year. Efforts in Lithuania to recognize same-sex partnerships, however, were also kind of in the legislative mix, but it ended up stalling. And I wonder if you can give us some insights into where the Baltic states currently stand with regard to LGBTQ rights and more of maybe some of the historical context of those rights in the region.
Sure, yeah. So I should preface this by saying that I really am not an expert on the histories of Latvia and Lithuania, even though the three Baltic states get sort of lumped into one category very often. They are quite different,
That's fair.
and particularly in this question of LGBTQ rights.
Yes.
To start off, I think the one bit of historical context that is really important is just how rapid and dramatic the shift in public attitudes and the legal situation towards LGBTQ people has been. All over the Baltics, but I can speak for Estonia specifically, and just to give you some idea of that, in 2020 2012, this is a couple of years before same-sex civil unions were legalized, popular support for marriage equality in Estonia stood at roughly about a third
Mhm.
of the population. So it was a sort of minority position by some distance. And we've now, over the course of basically 12 years, come to a point where not just marriage equality is now legal, has been legal for just about a year.
Yeah.
Um, and it also enjoys growing popular support. It has now majority support and had majority support in 2023 when it was legalized in parliament. So the shift really has been quite dramatic. So that's kind of one thing to keep in mind.
Mhm.
And I sort of remember when I first started getting involved with this question in 2010, 2011, it really was the kind of topic that no mainstream publication, no mainstream politician wanted to touch with a 10-foot pole.
Right.
We tried to poll legislators at the time on their opinion about same sex marriage or same sex civil partnerships. And the vast majority of legislators declined to answer the question. Like they just didn't want themselves to be associated with this. So the situation is now quite dramatically different. The other thing that I already alluded to is that the situation is quite different in different Baltic countries. So while Estonia now has broad majority support to same-sex marriage, overwhelming support, over 70% support to same-sex civil partnerships, and just the kind of broad question of do you think homosexuality is acceptable? These numbers are quite different in the different Baltic states.
Mhm.
So the kind of contrast to this is Lithuania, where a recent survey showed that only barely a quarter of the population supports same-sex marriage. So dramatically different context. And to a degree, these are contexts that are explained by history, culture, and politics, right? So Lithuania is a strongly Catholic country, and the kind of Catholic discourse that is a global discourse. That is particularly prominent in Poland, but also in other Catholic countries such as France. That really sees homosexuality as a sin and same-sex marriage as an affront to church doctrine is really something that dominates in Lithuania. I think the situation in Latvia is a bit more complicated, and you probably can tell me more about this than I can tell you. But it seems to me that a lot of that discourse has to do with sort of Russian-oriented political
Mhm.
parties and the discourse that is connected to sort of Kremlin's official position on gay rights and the preservation of so-called traditional marriage. Um, so yeah, so there's lots of context here that makes these three countries in some ways quite different, but I think they are also similar in that the broad sort of direction of travel over the past 2 decades has been towards the increasing acceptance of the LGBTQ community and increasing moves towards legislation that protects the rights of gay and queer people around the three Baltics.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that background. I'm no expert on the situation in Latvia, but it's quite interesting. Edgar Sienkiewicz, the president now, is like the first gay head of state in Europe. So at the same time, you're right that the discourse is quite difficult, and legislatures have taken quite a long time to implement some rulings from the Supreme Court, which has urged them to take steps towards approving civil unions and same-sex partnerships for a while. So, yeah, it's quite a mixed bag. You mentioned the situation in Lithuania and the kind of deep ties to Catholicism and faith, and that's something that I think often is thought of when we think of sort of resistance to LGBT rights. But you also wrote an article in 2019 called Sovereignty After Gender Trouble, where you look at more specifically Estonia, which is not really a particularly religious society in the same sort of way. And you look at how the opposition to LGBT rights drew arguments kind of more broadly, linking them to demography, state sovereignty, language, resistance to that kind of supranational authority. In this case, it was the European Union. And certainly demography and language in the Baltic states are are quite sort of existential hot topics. So I would love it if you could tell us a little bit more about that research. I found that article really interesting.
Yeah, I think the research was basically spurred by this question of why is this attack on what certain conservative groups call gender ideology, and we can characterize this as a sort of broadly homophobic sentiment. Why is this so popular? Not just in Estonia, but in a variety of different places where it seems that just saying that this is a basically a movement that's grounded in religious sentiment doesn't really quite explain its broad popularity among many different social groups.
Yeah.
And it is true also in the Estonian case that a lot of the leading activists of the so-called anti-gender movement come from religious backgrounds. So in the case of Estonia, they are fundamentalist
Mhm.
Catholics. And this is particularly puzzling because Catholicism in Estonia is a very sort of small religion. There are very few people who are Catholics. The Estonia in general is one of the least religious countries in the world.
Mhm.
And yet at the same time, this movement gained a lot of traction in the 2010s during this debate over same-sex civil unions. Now, basically what I found in my research when I looked at the kinds of arguments that these anti-gender activists and conservative politicians were making was that their arguments weren't really about religion. They weren't really about something like natural law that is something that's often invoked in Catholic discussions, but they were really about a question of sovereignty. And the way this argument was made was roughly like this, is that the Estonia, the sign, the symbol of health for the Estonian state is its population growth, right? Like when the population is growing, then the state is healthy. When the population is declining, then this means that Estonian sovereignty is under attack. And we see this in the Soviet period where mass migration of Russophone citizens sort of threatened the sort of Estonian demographic situation in the 1980s. This is how this argument is made.
Yeah.
And we're seeing this in the 2000s, where Estonian population, the kind of natural birth rate is declining. And what this must mean is that Estonian sovereignty is under threat by this different supranational organization, the European Union. And the links that these groups draw between the European Union and the Soviet Union are in some cases very direct. There are cartoons where you have a kind of fat cat Estonian politician bowing towards Moscow in 1988 and then towards Brussels in 2014.
Mhm.
And the problem with these kinds of supranational organizations is that they are out of touch with the will of the people. They're out of touch with what people consider to be a healthy way of living. And this is expressed through these programs like, supporting LGBT rights. So really, and I think that this tells us quite a bit about what draws the sort of broader population to this kind of rhetoric. It's not really, a Christian rhetoric, which is quite downplayed about sinfulness and natural law and righteous living and things like that. It's really a language about giving away power
Mhm.
to supranational entities. And in this telling, the support of the political class of Estonian liberals and social democrats towards LGBT rights then becomes a kind of proxy for saying, look, these are people whose interests lie with Brussels and not with the people in Tallinn or in Paide or in Kohtla-Järve or in these small towns that are being forgotten. And I think actually that move where gay rights become a stand-in for a kind of liberal alienation
Mhm.
and a kind of representation of a loss of sovereignty to supranational institutions is actually quite revealing, because I think that is broadly the same kind of argumentation that is being put forth in Poland
Mhm.
by the Law and Justice Party, by Viktor Orban's Fidesz, with, a sort of heavy dollop of anti-Semitism thrown in for good measure, and by the Rassemblement National in France as well. And by kind of peeling away the religious layers of this rhetoric, we really kind of get to what is at the heart of the matter.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, I think you could maybe with the supranational part is also perhaps not as intensive in the United States, but the idea of the kind of alienation, especially of the rural population or the areas that are underserved, and homosexuality as a kind of stand-in there for politicians is, I think it's instructive also there. As you noted, this article focuses kind of on the backlash to the European Union's kind of more progressive stance. You mentioned Poland, Hungary. These are also the close neighbors of the Baltic states in some ways, but on the other side, you have Finland, Sweden, and Northern Europe, decidedly more progressive in their stances. So I wonder if you could perhaps tell us a little bit about how the international community, be it organizations or be it close neighbors or even further neighbors, have influenced the trajectory for the Baltic states on these questions.
Yeah, of course. It's interesting that you bring up the Nordics, because I think this is really something that has made a very substantial difference in Estonia's trajectory compared to Latvia and Lithuania, is the very close economic and cultural ties to Sweden and Finland, and Norway as well, and therefore being able to benefit from many of the resources of these countries and in ways that are quite material. So, Norway's Gender Equality Fund, for instance, has financed a lot of Estonian NGOs.
Mm.
Had for a long time financed the Office of Gender Equality at the Ministry of Social Affairs. Lots of activists who've been working at this in Estonia for a long time have either, family in Finland or Sweden, or hail from there, or sort of Estonian Swedes or something like that. And generally, the sort of links and networks with Nordic organizations have been very tight. And so there's always been a lot of people who are willing to do advocacy work in Estonia when, in moments where local politicians have not been willing to speak up for gay rights. It has been quite easy to get someone like, for instance, Alexander Stubb, the current Finnish president, to give an interview on the issue, way back in 2011.
Mhm.
So I think that has made quite a big difference. I mean, this in some ways also opens up the local community to the criticism that they're sort of astroturfing, right? That these organizations are sort of EU funded organizations that again are somehow alienated from the rest of the population. I just want to make very, very clear that this is a very misleading argument,
Mhm.
because it hasn't been for a lack of wanting or a lack of initiative that these organizations have, evolved over the time that they have. It's been primarily due to a lack of funding. It's been due to the fact that there simply haven't been funding sources for people to build these organizations within Estonia. So they've gone to supranational organizations like the EU, like the Soros Foundation, or various Nordic sources of funding to do it.
Well, maybe we can continue on because I think we're already on this path, that you can tell us a little bit more about local activism, local organizations, and how that's impacting both kind of on the political side, legislation, but also on the social side. That's quite a dramatic statistic that you cited for Estonia, right? In just a handful of years, moving general acceptance of same-sex marriage.
Yeah, so the support for same-sex marriage right now is just over half of the population, and you can break this down demographically and see some interesting things in there. Sort of the below 25-year-olds overwhelmingly supported Russian language speakers tend to be more skeptical, but there the growth has been perhaps the fastest over the past couple of years. So yeah, the changes have been quite dramatic. And I think thinking about the organization and the kind of activist scene in Estonia, I think some things appear quite different if you look at it, particularly from an Anglophone or an American's perspective, which is that by and large, organizations in Estonia tend to be more oriented towards either internal community building or kind of professional policy work, really sort of working together with the Minister of Social Affairs, with legislators in the parties who are broadly favorable to LGBT rights, with various ministries and state organizations, rather than sort of having a kind of strong on the streets presence,
Hmm.
right? This kind of putting bodies on the streets and really pushing in that form hasn't been a particularly big part of the political activism, and certainly not in Estonia. I know less about Latvia and Lithuania. And in some sense, this has been, I think, both a positive and a negative aspect. Certainly, we've seen how quickly and well conservative organizations have organized and precisely around sort of big public meetings and building a kind of mass base of support for their agenda. And this has certainly made the fights in 2014 and to a lesser extent last year quite complicated. The other thing I think that's worth mentioning, and that some researchers like Paulina Lukinmaa have pointed out, is that the LGBTQ community and the organizations in particular tend to be quite divided along ethnic lines, right?
Hmm.
That there are many different communities for a long time didn't really talk to one another and have had very different experiences in Estonia, something that has been sort of compounded by the arrival of folks who are fleeing persecution in Russia,
Hmm.
and also Ukrainian LGBTQ people who have arrived in Estonia with the ongoing war in the past 2 years. So thinking about how to bring these communities together, I think has been generally one of the challenging aspects. Again, I'm relying here on research that I've read more than sort of direct experience. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, that is interesting to see how those cleavages also carry over into this type of work and activism. I wonder what do you see as the future for LGBT rights in the Baltic states? Do you see this growing convergence, this very rapid kind of shift that you've already pointed to continuing and convergence with Northern Europe maybe on the horizon? Is it tangible?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends a lot on political contingency.
Mhm.
I mean, I think one thing to keep in mind is that, for instance, the both the same-sex civil partnership law that was passed in Estonia in 2014 and the marriage equality law that was passed in 2023, these were not foregone conclusions.
Mhm.
These were sort of narrow votes, products of a lot of lobbying, and that could have gone in a different direction had a few things here and there been different. So they were really kind of utilizing the opportunity handed in a moment. And I think we need to keep this in
Yeah.
mind, right? And I think the Baltics are broadly in a similar situation all around, where small shifts in the political makeup of the country can dramatically change the situation on rights. I think one of the challenges that all three countries will face, and certainly Estonia is seeing this unfold right now, is that generally the parties that have most steadfastly supported queer rights have been liberal parties in the sense of being sort of broadly on the right, economically speaking. So the Reform Party in Estonia, that's the current prime minister's party, and at a certain point one can only go so far in that direction, right? And already after the last elections, we saw quite a bit of debate over whether the winning of marriage equality was really, well, let me think of how to sort of put this in the best way, that there's a trade-off if you sacrifice, for instance, progressive healthcare policy or progressive taxation policy for something like marriage equality,
Mm.
because, of course, queer people also need healthcare. In fact, they are more likely to require healthcare. They are more likely to be vulnerable to social dislocation. They are more likely to need government services. They are more likely to experience workplace discrimination. So they also need stronger labor protections.
Mhm.
So, this question of how much do you want to hitch your ride to the liberal bandwagon is one that I think is going to become increasingly acute now that these basic questions of civil rights have been more or less settled. Like, I don't think these are going to be turned back. But now we're starting to see that actually the experience of middle class queer people in Tallinn can be quite different from, poor queer people in the countryside. We are starting to think more about what is the difference between the experience of queer people who speak Estonian versus those who speak Russian. And I think figuring this out is going to be quite the challenge because there is not nearly such a consensus on issues of social policy than there is emerging on this sort of broader question of civil rights.
Yeah, that's a really good point to make. Thank you for highlighting it. Well, we're nearing the end of our time, but I want to ask you to tell us a little bit about what you are currently working on and if you have any recommended reading for listeners.
Sure. Yeah. No, this is the answer to the first question is going to take us quite far from this conversation since I gender and gender studies are a part of all of my research. It's a fundamental part of the human condition. So anything one studies, I think, should have a gender component to it. But
Yeah.
it's not the primary topic of my research right now. I'm interested in the history of information processing and governance and this idea of solving politics through computers. I'm following the story from the 1960s and the foundation of various institutes of cybernetics in places like Tallinn, Kiev, Vilnius, and elsewhere, to the story of the Estonian digital state that emerged in the 1990s and is still kind of the main branding exercise.
Estonia.
Yeah, Estonia, exactly, the digital republic. And, it's still asking questions about the relationship of expertise to power, the way people imagine political communities, and the way people imagine bodies.
Mm.
So it carries many of the themes of the stuff that I've researched before, but taking it a little bit closer to the Baltic states.
Yeah.
And then as for reading recommendations, I really would love for people to engage with the work of Irina Roldugina, who is, I think, currently at the University of Pittsburgh. She's a fantastic scholar of Soviet social queer history, really a kind of queer history written from the bottom up.
Mm.
And it's really phenomenal reading. She's found archives that are just astounding in what they reveal, but also in how difficult it is to really discover queer voices in the archive, which have tended to marginalize them throughout the 20th century. Folks who read Estonian, I really would like to recommend the collected volume titled Kalevi alt välja, which is edited by my friend and colleague Uku Lember and Rebecca Põldsam and Andreas Kalkun, which chronicles, again, sort of bottom up queer histories in Estonia from the 19th century to the present. And I think it'd be a very nice companion to this exhibit on queer Balto-German art that's right now running at the National Art Museum in Tallinn. So also really, really interesting stuff, again, uncovering a part of Baltic queer history that I had no idea about personally. So and it's great art to boot. So yeah, lots of good stuff out there.
Yeah, those are excellent recommendations. We'll be sure to link them also in the bottom of our podcast notes. And, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us, for sharing your perspective. your vast array of research topics and for honing in on this subject with us this time. But perhaps we'll have to speak again on some of your other work. So I just want to thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, would be happy to talk more. Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you for tuning in to Baltic Ways, a podcast from the Association for the Advancement of Baltic Studies, produced in partnership with the Baltic Initiative at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. And note that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of AABS or FPRI. I'm your host, Indre Ekmanis. Subscribe to our newsletters at aabs-balticstudies.org and fpri.org/Baltic-initiative for more from the world of Baltic studies. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.